This week we are covering formative evaluation. This is essentially the research one would do about your campaign before actually beginning. So a couple of things that we're going to get through is covering the types of formative evaluation, the goals, processes, and types of pre-testing. So we'll get into all these pieces in just a moment. But one of the things I wanted to start with is, why is this even necessary? What would be the point in this? Shouldn't I simply know what we ought to do? Well, if we look at an example, generally we would do this because there are a lot of issues that just don't receive a lot of attention that are out there. Or there may be a problem that we just don't have a really good solution about. So for instance, we might look at farm safety. So we're trying to talk about how it is that someone from a university or from a nonprofit is going to go to farms and tell farmers how to be safe on their equipment. Well, how do you motivate farmers to be safer? Is there an assumption that they're not being safe? What are we saying to them right now? What would they listen to? So if you don't think this is something that matters, for instance, there's lots of instances where tractors and other equipment might tip over, or there might be people working on the maintenance of their equipment who don't have the training to work on new, updated, highly technological machinery, and a lot of times people are injured. There are a lot of people losing limbs because they don't know how to use the equipment safely. And so apparently there is a need to go have these conversations. So are we going to have someone from a university going out in a suit and tie, walking up to someone in the middle of a field and try to tell them how to use their equipment? No, I think we need to use a little bit more nuanced approach to that. Well, how do we do that? What might work? So this is an instance where having formative research, going and talking to people and figuring it out, would be useful. Another example, a little bit more specific, getting into some details, little background here for you. There's obviously the amount of instances of sexual assault or rapes that are reported is much lower than the actual occurrence. Now, one particular instance where this happened was in Milwaukee, and the extent to which statutory rape was being reported. And this is an instance where someone who is over the age of consent is having sex with someone who is under the age of consent. So what was occurring was that of the teen pregnancies that were occurring in Milwaukee, 71% of the teen pregnancies had a father who was over 20. So these were 16-year-olds who were having children with people who were over 20. So what was going on is that no one was reporting who the father was, because the moment they did that, the father could then be arrested for statutory rape. So it was the question of having the ability to compel someone to be involved through things like child support. If you did that, then that would mean that the father was no longer available for child support because they would be in prison. And so this was not being addressed. And so the city of Milwaukee, the United Way in the city, got together and said, we need a campaign in order to prevent this from happening in the first place. And so they hired an ad agency who was going to help them out. And what they produced was a series of billboards that they wanted to post all around the city in order to encourage people to recognize seeing someone who is too young as being not someone they should be attracted to. So they came up with this. And in the background, it says, if you see a child as anything more, it's wrong. And you have an adult body with clearly a child's face. And on the bottom, the banner says, if you're over 18 and having sex with an underage girl, it's statutory rape. So this was the campaign that they generated. So here is another instance. Just because she has the body doesn't mean she has the brains. Again, adult body, child head. One more example. When you look at a young girl as something more, you need help. Again, if you're over 18 having sex with an underage girl, it's statutory rape. So this ad campaign never actually went live in the way that they wanted to, because they presented these materials to the city and they said, no, you can't post this all over the city. This is totally inappropriate. They said when people look at this, they're not looking at the face. They're looking neck down. They're not paying attention to anything else. And as it turns out, there was another problem that people noticed, is that the only flyer that showed someone not having the brains was the young black girl, not the young white girl. So the black girl didn't have the brains but had the body, and the rest of them just happened to look young. So there was a racial issue. There was obviously this is inappropriate, this isn't going to work. But as it turns out, the ad agency actually did some formative research, and they found that this was an effective campaign with the target audience of young men and women. And they found it to be effective. And you can find, I will include a link to the actual focus group interviews that they did, and you can kind of see how they thought this was going to be useful. So why would we do this, right? Why would we say, let's bother to do the research part of it? Well, hopefully these examples drive home the fact that we need to make sure what we're doing is going to work. A lot of times these campaigns cost a lot of money to produce and promote and distribute these materials. A lot of times people are paid in order to do these campaigns, and there are a lot of times people's lives on the line. So if we're going to do a campaign, it should work, and we want to make sure that when we do finally unleash this thing, it's going to have the outcomes we hope it will and not something else. So we can do a couple of things. We can do pre-production research, formative research, in which we can look up pre-existing information. What have others done? What campaign strategies seem to have worked? Just because everyone is doing it this way doesn't mean that's going to work. So for instance, everyone who researches sexual health tends to use a fear appeal approach, trying to scare the audience. And then we might find that, gosh, that's not working. So maybe we should do something different. We can also look at production testing, sometimes called pre-testing. So this is where we would develop our campaign materials, we get our messages, we get our images, we get our media all put together, and then we find some of our audience and show them, and we kind of see, is this going to work? Is this something that people are going to find effective? And if so, then we can be reasonably confident we can unleash the entire campaign. So a couple of things we were going to look at. The primary uses or goals of formative research is to identify some target audience. What about them? What are their needs? What do they want? So as I'm sitting in my office and thinking about how I'm going to target my audience and who are they and what do they need, I may be totally out of touch with the reality of someone's lived experience in this situation. Just because I can think it doesn't mean that's what's going to be beneficial to them. It also allows us to consider what are the most appealing benefits. The reality is efforts to address human social needs are going to be overwhelmed by the extent to which help is needed. The amount of help one can provide is never going to match the need. So sometimes you have to make difficult decisions of what is it we're actually going to tackle, what is realistic, or what may be the difficult path, knowing it needs to be done and accepting that there's going to be some disappointment and a lack of success. It allows us to develop some offerings and deliver a strategy. So we can now, talking to our target audience, we can find out what kind of media they consume. So we may have thought that we needed to have a social media blitz of our information, getting it all out there, but it turns out that's not where they're looking. They're watching Comedy Central at 3 a.m. Well, I better get my ad on Comedy Central at 3 a.m. because that's where they are. Or I only need to advertise on YouTube because they're not watching anything else consistently, and I need to make sure that my campaign works on a relatively short YouTube-friendly ad mechanism. So I'm going to go through a couple of the variables of interest that are identified in the readings that I've provided to you. I'm not going to belabor them, just kind of highlight them, because any number of these are going to be useful at any given time. Some of the variables that you may have to deal with when you're trying to figure out what you want to tackle is knowledge and literacy. What do people actually know and what do they understand? So just because people have access to information doesn't mean they really understand it. So we could present people with messages that we think are going to be useful, but it's like talking to a brick wall. That's not particularly useful. We have to figure out some of their beliefs and perceptions as well as attitudes and values. What do they think? How do they feel about things? What do they think is important in life? And how do they come to those conclusions? Knowing how to navigate people's thoughts and feelings allows us to be able to address them in a way that's going to be successful. So if someone thinks that The way you should behave is based on their core religious values, and then we make an attempt to convince them to do something that is not tied to that in any way or is not compatible. They're not going to do what we ask them to do because those values were so important to them. We can also look at what they consider to be salient priorities, or what is just right in front of their face. So kind of going back to echoing that Maslow's hierarchy of needs I talked about previously. People are going to pay attention to the problem that's in front of them. And if we're talking about something that's not the problem in front of them, then we have to figure out how to make this be the problem in front of them. We also think about the efficacy and skills that people have. If people don't feel capable of doing the solution that you're providing them, they're not going to do it. If they don't have the skill to do it, then maybe the first step we might have in the campaign is simply teaching the skills before we then go ask them to use the skills. It's not very useful to tell them to do something they aren't capable of doing. And lastly, media consumption patterns, just simply knowing what to do. So a great example of this was during the Obama campaign. They were literally block by block monitoring who were likely voters. And there was a story in Chicago of there were certain neighborhoods they really wanted to reach, and they knew that the people who worked in that neighborhood tended to work downtown, and so they rode the train, and so they knew which train line they would be taking and placed the billboards they wanted people to see when it would be visible by that specific line, because that is going to be boarded by the people from the location they wanted to reach. That is that is precise, right? Those are the kinds of things that we would love to be able to do, but we don't have presidential campaign kind of money usually. So typically we're thinking about where people tend to be, and we want to make sure we reach them where they are. So pre-testing research is where we take a message and we try it out. Sometimes we'll have a couple of different versions. So basically we need to create the test message. We'll come up with what we wanted to say. So there may be different wording, there may be different delivery options, and we will see how people are going to respond to those. And so we'll look for, do people notice it? So in the media landscape in front of them, do they even notice that our message happened? And if not, we need to do something different to get them to notice it. It also allows us to measure comprehension, right? So if knowledge and literacy is something that matters, then we can ask them, did you understand this message? If so, explain it to me. And if they can't do that, well, they didn't really understand it, did they? It also helps us identify strong points and weak points in our campaign. So I might think that I have just the absolute brilliant campaign delivery process. I've got a great message, got a great distribution model in front of me, and the message wasn't very good, right? And so that's what the pre-testing is going to tell me. Yeah, my delivery was great, but my message was pretty bad, and so I can change that. We can also gauge relevance to our audience. So I might have thought that this would be really relevant or would be a salient problem to them. And so they might agree, yeah, it's a great message. It's really persuasive. It's really strong. I saw it. I noticed it. I understood it. I don't know how this affects me. And so if they don't recognize that, then you weren't going to change their behavior. And the last thing is to gauge controversy. So this is something that the Milwaukee campaign that I showed you attempted to do in their own initial campaign research, is they gauged how people would think this would be a good campaign or not. But you might have a great message and people are just really offended by it. And so the conversation that occurs isn't, was this a good message? It's more, I can't believe they did that. And so that's not a very useful message either. So I'm going to talk about the types of pre-testing that we can do. There are pros and cons to each, but they all have their place. So the first is a focus group interview. I will bring a group of people into a room, show them something, and then have a conversation with that group of people and kind of see how they respond. The utility here is that they're cost effective. I can put more people in a room relatively cheaply. The downside is that if someone disagrees with the majority, they tend not to speak up. So you tend to kind of hear what you wanted to hear in a focus group interview. Individual in-depth interviews solve that problem of people not being able to speak up, but they're very time intensive and can become expensive. If you're spending an hour with each participant and you wanted to talk to 50 people, well, that's 50 hours. Whereas a focus group, I could talk to 50 people, 10 at a time, in 5 hours. That sounds a lot more appealing. And now the worst named interview I've ever seen, central location intercept interviews, which basically just means go where your target audience is and just start grabbing them at random and start interviewing them. So I know this is dating me a bit, but if you've ever been at a mall, I know it's this like actual location where people go sometimes to buy things. And so if you were walking around a mall and someone would walk up to you with a clipboard or an iPad and say, hey, can I ask you a few questions? That's central location intercept interviewing. So you're just finding your target audience and start asking them where they are. You can also do self-administered questionnaires, so basic, surveys. Hey, please take this survey. The beauty there, it's cheap. You can get lots of responses. But the problem is that people who were kind of annoyed with what you're asking them may not seek out the survey, and so you'll oftentimes miss some information. And the last is theater testing. This is really cool when it's done. It tends to be expensive, and it's literally, right, a theater. You might pack 50 people into a room, and you can either hook them up to biophysical responses, so you can measure things like galvanic skin response, you can measure, electric conductivity in their skin, you can measure their respiration, their heart rate, do they get excited about the thing that you're talking about? Or you can have them do things like completing a survey as they watch it. You can also have them, there's things called dials. It's literally just a knob, and they can turn it as they see things. So as you see things that you like on the screen, turn it to the right. As you see things you don't like on the screen, turn it to the left. And so if I'm piloting a message and it turns out that people don't really like some part of it, I'll see a lot of people turning, to their knob so that they don't like it. And so that allows me to know specifically what part of the message is that I need to address. These are wonderful. Again, the same problem. It can be expensive to get that many people in the room at the same time. And also just setting it up is expensive. It requires some technical know-how in getting these tools to work and to work well and keep them maintained, and just buying them in the first place. A lot of nonprofits don't have that kind of ability. So lots of pre-testing options. All of them have their use, but in general, we want to make sure that when we're releasing a campaign that we know that we have a good message, we have a good distribution, and we know that the reception is going to be what we want it to be.